Hey, you know how plants are everywhere? You may even have them inside your house. But where did they come from? I mean, from another plant. But what about the first plant? Have you ever wondered? Let me tell you a secret. At some point, plants didn't exist. I know, crazy. First of all, what even is a plant? Plants are also called embryofites, because all of them have embryos during their sporophytic phase. Plants have two phases during their life cycle, a haploid gametophytic phase called gametophyte. Haploid means it just has one copy of all its genetic information. This individual is responsible for sexual reproduction because it creates the gametes, the male one being small and motile while the female one is bigger and doesn't move. When they combine, they form a new cell called the zygote. This is now diploid because it has two copies of the genetic information. The zygote divides and then becomes the embryo, which grows into the sporophytic phase, or sporophyte, the individual that creates haploid spores through meiosis that form the gametophyte. As you can see, the cycle repeats and one phase gives rise to the other one, in a process called alternation of generations. Okay, now let's make sense of all of this. If you think of most plants that you see every day, that's the sporophytic phase, like a tree. In these same plants, the gametophytic phase is very small, so much that it is inside the sporophytic phase. Let's get into that a bit deeper. You've seen a flower, right? Okay, a flower is part of the sporophytic phase. Inside the flower, the female gametophyte or megagametophyte develops here in the ovary, and the male gametophyte or microgametophyte develops inside the pollen grains. So in this case, the gametophytic phase is very small, so much that it lives within the sporophyte. However, this is not the case for all plants. We were talking about embryos. This is how they look, at least some of them. They are very pretty if you look at them long enough. Otherwise, they just look scary and weird. They are the precursor of the sporophyte. It is still immature, but it contains all the structures needed to grow and become the sporophyte. Particularly, the shoots and leaves come from the apical meristem and the roots from the radicular meristem. Let's say you eat an apple, and then you get to the seeds. The embryo is inside the seeds. That is why if you were to plant it, a tree would come out. Now, not all plants have seeds, but all of them have embryos. It just so happens that the embryos of apples are inside a seed. Well, now you know what a plant is. Now erase them from your mind because at some point they didn't exist. We know from fossil and molecular evidence, that is from DNA and protein sequences, that they appeared during the Ordovician, which spanned from 488 million years ago until 443 million years ago. During this time, Earth kinda looked like this. I got this map from the paleobiology database, so give them a check. Organisms were mainly in the oceans, which were filled with invertebrates like trilobites. You know those guys, right? There were many other things, but we are interested in our green friends. So what happened? We know that during this time, algae were around, and the short answer is that algae are the ancestors of plants. That doesn't mean that all algae became plants. A better way to put it is that plants share a common ancestor with a group of algae, particularly green algae, that mostly live in freshwater environments. In this context, a common ancestor refers to an organism that had all the characteristics that these two groups share, and the differences they have are due to their separate evolutionary histories. Let's pause there for a moment. If plants and algae are related, how can we tell them apart? What is an algae? Well, that last question is a bit complicated. See, the term algae applies to a very big and diverse group of organisms, so finding common traits can be a bit difficult. A good starting point is to look for organisms that are photosynthetic and that are usually associated with aquatic environments. However, this still may not apply to some algae out there, but we can go from here. Some are unicellular, some are pluricellular. There may be eukaryotes, prokaryotes, and of course, not all of them look like plants. But the ones who do, how are they different? Well, looking at their anatomy, algae don't really have tissues. That is, a group of cells that are differentiated and as a group carry out a specific function. Algae do have differentiated cells, but they don't form tissues. However, plants do have them. In terms of reproduction, both algae and plants have alternating generations, but only plants have a diploid embryo. There are of course many other differences, but let's leave it at that. How did plants eventually happen? That's what we've been trying to get to. In a nutshell, green algae started living on land, and then became plants. However, it is not that simple. This was a process that took a very long time. Also, living outside of water can be quite hard. You need to have rigid structures to support your own weight, like your bones. But of course, plants and algae don't have bones. Also, the sun hits harder on the surface, and you have to deal with that extra UV radiation and loss of water from evaporation. Compare that to living on water, where the liquid that surrounds you provides buoyancy and supports your body. Also, nutrients are dissolved on water, and that makes them easier to gobble up. There are some other considerations, but you get the idea. Since life started on water, living it implied that those organisms that ventured outside its comforts needed to accumulate a series of new characteristics in order to survive these new conditions. So why do it? Were green algae a bunch of tryhards? We don't know. We just can assume that in some way acquiring these new characteristics provided an advantage, and they kept happening, slowly giving rise to organisms that live outside of water and that we now know as plants. One thing that hasn't been completely solved is which group of green algae directly shares a common ancestor with plants. We know it could be either one of these. This lack of specificity is due to the nature of the evidence used to reconstruct the evolutionary history. DNA and protein sequences, as well as morphological data, just can't provide a unique and precise picture to that level of accuracy. These three groups, along with some other ones, are called streptophyte algae, because the group made up of these algae and plants is called Streptophyta. You may be asking, how do we know that algae and plants are related? The answer lies in the characteristics they share because they evolved from the same ancestor. This article highlights the importance of the cell wall, that is, the rigid structure that envelops the whole cell. But streptophyte algae and plants have cell walls. Here it is mentioned that the cell wall of streptophytes may have provided structural support outside of water, as well as protection from UV light. One important thing about all this is that when the cell divides, it needs to create a new cell wall. The structure that takes care of this in streptophyte algae and plants is the phragmoblast, which is a structure that works as a scaffold for the new material that will be part of the new cell wall. One possible explanation is that the same structure is present in both groups due to common ancestry. This observation by itself may not be sufficient to support the idea that plants and streptophyte algae share a common ancestor, but there is a whole lot of evidence that points to the same conclusion, so we can be quite certain about it. There are, however, details that we can't know, such as the intermediate steps that eventually led to the group that we now know as plants. But a general idea is presented in this paper. Stratophytes likely live on freshwater environments, where they were constantly exposed to the shore and adapted to the conditions of the surface while staying close to water. They had very little competition, since the land was quite empty at that time, so they were very successful out there. An interesting point is that marine algae are also exposed to the surface, but it seems that the jump from water to land was less complicated in organisms that live in freshwater environments, because it is harder to transition from water to land from the conditions of salinity, temperature, exposure to sunlight, and other things that are proper of marine environments. In this way, streptophytes were already adapted to using rainwater to survive on the surface, while marine organisms wouldn't have been able to do it. And that's the general picture, how algae made the jump to land and then became plants, which eventually conquered everywhere. Not by force clearly, it was just very empty. From that point on, plants diversified and gave rise to all the many different forms we can see today, and some that have already become extinct. The last thing I would like to touch on is, what about the very first plants? Can we know how they look like? The answer is no. where we can look for clues. The group which would be most like the earliest plants is probably the bryophytes, which is made up of liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. Now, don't think of this as primitive. It's not like they are the cavemen of plants. When we say that they could be the most similar to the very first plants, it means that through their evolutionary history, they haven't changed too much, and still retain some of the key features that the earliest plants may have had. What are those characteristics? Probably their proximity to water and humid environments, a life cycle dominated by the gametophytic phase, these guys over here, and a lack of well-defined tissues. Okay, that is the end. I hope there was something interesting for you here. When I first learned about all these things, I was fascinated with the idea of a barren earth that filled little by little with plants that kept changing. I think they are pretty cool. There is a whole lot to talk about that, so stick around and maybe you'll find out something else.